Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As the Israel-Hamas conflict enters its fourth day and is clearly escalating, we ask, what does the future look like for Benjamin Netanyahu, for Hamas, for the Arab countries of the Middle East, and indeed for the world as a whole? Those are the key issues I shall raise today with the chief foreign affairs commentator of the Financial Times, the highly regarded and well-known Gideon Rachman. Mr. Rachman, let's start with Benjamin Netanyahu before we broaden our discussion and talk about the other people and organizations affected by this conflict. In an op-ed that you wrote for your paper, The Financial Times, yesterday, you said, and I'm quoting you, Netanyahu's entire strategy towards the Palestinians now looks like a failure. Is that because his aim was to shrink the conflict with the Palestinians and push it to one side as he built relationships with other Arab countries, but now, after the Hamas attack, that Palestinian issue has been forced back to the very center of the Middle Eastern agenda in a way in which it's now going to be very difficult to sideline or diminish?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of both a domestic and an international aspect to the failure of Netanyahu's strategy. And for the Israelis, obviously, the domestic bit is what matters, is essentially what he said to Israel is, I am Mr. Security was his tagline, that he was the guy who would ensure that if you were an Israeli, you would live a normal life, that you wouldn't have to worry about terrorism anymore. And under Netanyahu, basically, Israel moved away from the idea that there could be a peace treaty with the Palestinians into a much more security focused way of looking at the issue. That they built the wall with the West Bank, and they thought a kind of impregnable security ring around Gaza, and so that if you were living in Israel proper, you could take the bus, go to work, you didn't have to worry about there being a bomb on it, etc. And that was the essential promise, and it was really something that most Israelis embraced. The left, which used to argue for the urgent necessity of a peace agreement with the Palestinians, has been losing support steadily over decades. So Netanyahu's argument had essentially kind of commanded the political center in Israel. And then globally, he was saying to the world, look, you have always been saying to me and to Israel, you've got to make peace with the Palestinians. But they're not ready for it. So why don't you, particularly the Arab nations, just make peace with Israel directly? Forget your idea that you have to have a deal with the Palestinians before you can do this. There's a lot that Israel and the Gulf states can do together. Israel's very technologically advanced and so on. And that policy was making a lot of progress. They'd already normalized with the UAE, with Bahrain, and the big prize was Saudi Arabia. And both Netanyahu and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto head of Saudi Arabia, had both said in recent weeks, we're very close to a peace deal. And then for Netanyahu, that would have been a kind of a crowning achievement. He would have normalized relations with the Arab world, with all the kind of commercial and peace opportunities that offered to Israel, without doing the two-state solution that people always said was a precondition. But now that bit's also in big trouble because although the Saudis, I think, would in some level like to have this deal with Israel. They have to be mindful of Arab public opinion. And while here in the West, at the moment, everybody's very focused on the sort of atrocities perpetrated on Israeli civilians. I can pretty well guarantee you that if you're watching television in the Arab world, it'll all be about the Gaza and the, civilians being killed there. And in that climate, and I think it'll last quite a while, it's really impossible for the Saudis to do a deal with the Israelis. So I think both bits of the Netanyahu strategy, the domestic and the international, are in trouble.
With both bits of his strategy, as you put it, domestic and international, in trouble, how damaged is he as a prime minister?
Well, we'll see. I mean, obviously, after a trauma like this, people don't really want to turn on each other inside Israel. So for the moment, he speaks for the nation. He is the prime minister, etc. So, if you could say that a tragedy like this is good for him, in that sense, it's been, good for him. Because I think the thing to remember is that Netanyahu's position was very shaky before this. I mean, in one sense, he's the dominant figure in Israeli politics. He's now the prime minister who served longer than any other prime minister in Israeli history, including Ben Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister. But he is on trial for alleged corruption and fraud. And the Israeli left and center, the left doesn't really exist, but let's say the center, have increasingly felt that they cannot do business with him because he has gone into coalition. Israeli politics is a very, very fractured scene. It's always very hard to form a government. The only way Netanyahu could form a government last time was by going into coalition with the real far right. These are including, say, a minister like Ben-Gvir, who's now being put in charge of security on the West Bank, who has been convicted by an Israeli court of support for terrorism. To give you an idea of the kind of person that Ben-Gvir is, he at one stage had a poster on his wall of a guy called Baruch Goldstein, who was an Israeli terrorist who had machine gunned Palestinians in Hebron. Who an appalling figure. And so for a lot of the Israelis, that including those parties, to basically support the government, not to support it, but to really push policy in a more radical direction, that was too far. But actually, the thing that really caused the revolt against the Netanyahu government, that has led to huge demonstrations in Israel every weekend for the last few months, anti-government demonstrations, is an effort that he was doing to change the judiciary. And for the Israeli opposition, that was ultimately a threat to Israeli democracy. Israel's got a very odd situation. It doesn't really have a formal constitution with checks and balances like the United States. So the main check and balance on the government and what it can do is the courts. And the courts have occasionally said, for example, you can't do this or that policy on the West Bank or inside Israel because it's unreasonable. And Netanyahu was trying to change that. And a lot of the Israeli opposition say he is turning us into a country like, say, Hungary, which is formally democratic, where Orban wins elections, but where a lot of the checks and balances that you would have in a democracy, particularly the judiciary or the civil service, is defanged, and therefore effectively it's a sort of one-party state. And that is the backdrop to what was happening. And then the really interesting question is, in political terms, how does all that argument shake out? And as I say, I think, of course, the initial reaction is everybody says that stuff doesn't matter anymore. We've just had, women and children massacred. We have to come together. But I think that those divisions will reemerge fairly quickly. In fact, they already have. Haret, which is the newspaper, which is the voice of the Israeli left, has already done an editorial saying, look, this is Netanyahu's fault. And they draw a direct line between the kind of government he's formed and what's just happened. They say, look, one of the reasons this has happened is that he's got these far-right parties in the government. They have been stirring up aggressive settler attacks on the West Bank. That means the Israeli army has had to move from Gaza, the border with Gaza, to the West Bank. That left Israel vulnerable. Now, whether that is actually what happened, maybe a commission of inquiry will establish. But those are the kinds of arguments that are taking place. And a final thought on this, Netanyahu and the opposition have both said, well, we need a national unity government. But at the moment, they're really finding it difficult because the central parties do not want to go into a government and sit around a cabinet table with people they regard as fascists, like Ben Gvir. Netanyahu is not prepared to kick those guys out yet. So they haven't even really been able to form a national unity government as things stand.
Let me, for the sake of an audience in India, explain a little bit about Haret, which you mentioned and quoted a little while ago. It's probably one of the most influential papers in the country, and on the 8th, that's just 2 days ago, the paper squarely blamed Benjamin Netanyahu for what it called the disaster that befell Israel. And specifically, it accused his government of annexation and dispossession and his foreign policy of ignoring the existence and rights of Palestinians. And then on the 9th, which is yesterday, it warned against campaigns of vengeance and commission of war crimes. That's clearly a warning against the strategy he plans to adopt of massive retaliation. So even if in the short term, both politicians and the country unite behind him, are we looking down a road where the end of his political career now looks in sight?
Well, I'm not a Netanyahu fan, so in some ways, I personally would hope so, but I wouldn't bank on it, actually, because, Haaretz is an influential paper and an important paper, but, it's read, by people like you and me outside the country. It's a voice of a liberal intellectual kind of wing of India, not of India, of Israel, and which, has been growing weaker. And, somebody said, well, it's like, a New York Times editorial or, the London Review of Books or something. It's for whether it, particularly in this climate, represents Israeli public opinion. I doubt it, actually, to be honest. And my concern is, although I think a lot of the criticisms of Netanyahu, okay, I live in London, it's not my fight really, but they seem to me to be legitimate. But I think what happens in crises like this is countries typically move right. They don't move left. They don't say, well, we need to sort of think about this in the round. The cry for vengeance is very, very loud. And so my fear is actually it empowers not just Netanyahu, but the far right. But we'll see.
Let's, against that background, look at the big question that faces him. What does he do now vis-a-vis the crisis he's got on his hands? He's promised, as I said, a massive retaliation, and clearly every night we see it happening, and every night it's escalating compared to the night before. But the problem is, as you wrote in that Financial Times op-ed yesterday, the Israeli government does not yet have any vision that goes beyond killing Hamas leaders. So beyond the principle, revenge is sweet, is there a danger this could exacerbate the crisis rather than create political space for him?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I don't think they would even accept those terms. I think that they would say, well, how do you exacerbate a crisis in which we've just had these massacres in Israel? It's almost wrong at this point to start thinking in sort of grand strategic terms. We need to go out, kill these people, take revenge. So I think the strategy, if you can call it, is to destroy Hamas. And they may, manage to kill most of the leadership and a lot of the fighters, and to, they'll kill a lot of civilians in the process, and that's already happening. But I don't know that they yet have a view of what to replace Hamas with, who would run Gaza. If this was the West Bank, you could say that there are the kind of far right radicals would have a vision, which is to drive the Palestinians off the territory and take it over and incorporate it into Israel. That's really the vision for the West Bank, not so much for Gaza. I don't think the Israelis want to reoccupy it. And frankly, it's sort of inconceivable that they could drive 2 million Palestinians off that land. So who governs it? If the Israelis reoccupy it, and it looks like they've got 300,000 troops massing with the possibility of a land offensive, I think that will happen. But then how do they get out again? Gaza is incredibly densely populated. You would certainly have many, many Palestinian casualties, but you would also have the Israeli army. sustaining heavy casualties. And this is a conscript, not a conscript army. It's a civilian army. These are the reservists who've come up. A lot of them, the hostages who are there are another question. Women, kids. The Hamas are threatening to kill them sort of on a daily basis in response to Israeli attacks. You'd have more Israelis taken hostages. It would be a horrific mess. I think they may do it anyway. But
sorry, carry on.
No, I think yeah.
I'll tell you why I raised that question, because there's something that he said yesterday, Netanyahu, according to the Times of Israel. He said, we are going to change the Middle East. Is that the sort of threat or challenge that could draw Hezbollah and, more importantly, Iran directly into the conflict? So far, Hezbollah has fired a few rockets, and John Kirby has reiterated what Blinken said earlier, that there is no direct evidence of Iran's role. And certainly Ayatollah Khomeini earlier today has repeated that, whether you believe him or not. But my question is Netanyahu potentially playing with trouble when he starts to talk about, and then perhaps tries to do, a change in the whole structure of the Middle East?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of a lot of the Israelis have said that this is Israel's 9/11, and in the emotional impact is, I think, very similar to when the towers came down in New York. And if you remember, after that, Bush said they have to change the Middle East, that it's not enough just to find the people who did this and kill them. You had to change the whole structure that had created this, and that led America into some appalling errors. Most obviously the invasion of Iraq, where and in fact, the desire in America to blame Iraq for 9/11 when it was clearly it was actually Al Qaeda, because I think they needed to think that there was a bigger villain out there than just this kind of ragtag Islamist army of Al Qaeda. Reminds me a bit of Israel saying now, this isn't just Hamas, it's Iran. But I mean, that said, you can't push the analogy too far. And there is a long history of ties between Iran and Hamas. Whether Iran told them to do that, I don't think there's much evidence for that yet. And actually, I mean, one even slightly hopeful thing is I actually don't think that Iran or Israel have an interest in going to war with each other directly. For Iran, this is a survivor regime which has been around since 1979, still going despite everything that's been thrown at it: sanctions, internal rebellions, the war with Iraq, the opposition of Saudi Arabia and Israel. I think the one thing that could destroy the Iranian regime is if they got sucked into a wider war, and then who knows who would come in, maybe the Americans would, maybe even the Saudis would, I don't know. So they don't want that. And for the Israelis, they've got enough on their hands without taking on a major, a huge war with a major well-armed country. I don't think that's in their interests. So I hope it won't expand into an Israel-Iran war.
Before I turn to Hamas, let me point out to the Indian audience that your article in the Financial Times yesterday actually ended, if I remember correctly, by pointing out that the American overreaction to 9/11 was, I think your words were, misconceived and self-destructive. And your last sentence said you hoped Israel did not make a similar mistake this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I think the similarity in the psychology is clearly there. If you've been through a trauma like that, the desire to do everything, India, interestingly, didn't really respond like that initially after the Mumbai attacks, but Indians will remember how horrific that was. And in fact, India showed some restraint. I know it's still controversial whether that was the correct response, but the American-Israeli way was to respond immediately. And although there'll be those who say that's exactly what you should do, get tough, etc., etc., did the war on terror work out well for America? I think indirectly it led to Donald Trump. It led to a lot of Americans being killed, and as well as a lot of Iraqis, obviously even more Iraqis, and not to a situation that hasn't worked out in a way they would have liked in either Iraq or Afghanistan.
Let's come at that point. Sorry. Let's come at that point to Hamas, Mr. Rachman.
Yeah.
Although it's clearly brought down on the people of Gaza the wrath of Israel, and they today are not only being badly bombed, but they're denied electricity, water, fuel, and food supplies. Can Hamas nonetheless claim credit for two things. One, for restoring the Palestinian issue to the center of the Middle Eastern agenda. And secondly, perhaps, for replacing the Palestine Authority and Fatah as the main representative of the Palestinian cause. Or would you disagree?
I think it's too early to tell. And if I was the Palestinians, would I want Hamas as my public face? Given what they've just done, it was pretty horrific. And of course, there will be people around the world who rally to them and say, "Well, what do you expect, given the way that the Palestinians have been treated?" But on the other hand, the pictures that are coming out are not a great advert for Hamas. The treatment of women, children, etc., etc. So for that to become the face of Palestine would seem to me to be a disaster for the Palestinians. But I think what is interesting is that just as I was saying, there are big divisions inside Israel. There are big divisions within the Palestinian cause. The West Bank is controlled by Fatah, which is the sort of internationally accepted bit of the Palestinians. Hamas who control Gaza, have no real friends in what you might call the civilized world. They're backed by Iran and a few kind of really extremist factions in the Middle East. But I don't think this is a success for the Palestinians. I think it's a disaster for the Palestinians in the long run. There's a sort of emotional analogy, just as I was saying, the Israelis want to do everything possible, kill as many, Hamas fighters and maybe civilians right now in revenge. I think, that for Hamas, just showing that they are capable of doing this is a success, and of course they will, among a certain group, achieve a kind of mythological status for taking down the all-powerful Israeli military, etc., etc. But politically, and for Palestinians as a people, they will pay a horrible human cost, and I don't think it advances them politically. I think it sets them back politically.
But would you agree with the first half of my question, that they've restored the Palestine issue to the center of the Middle Eastern agenda? It was in serious danger of being pushed to the sidelines by the American brokered Saudi-Israel deal, which may not happen. But that now is not likely, and Palestine is an issue.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, but we'll see. You can argue it either way. I mean, I think that there'll be a lot of lip service paid now, but equally, I think people will say, look, it's just inconceivable there are peace talks now. Who in Israel is going to sit down with Hamas? Nobody. And it's interesting, actually. I was at the Labour Party conference yesterday in Britain, and the Palestinian ambassador was speaking to a big crowd. And he is a Fatah guy, and Fatah hate Hamas. So the obvious thing for him to have said is Hamas do not speak for the Palestinians. But he did not say that. He just sort of, he kind of fudged it, etc., etc. So there is, I always found it a bit too convenient when the Israelis said, we don't have a partner to talk to. It was, I think, not really true for many periods, but it kind of is true now. So, yeah, everyone will say we need peace talks, but I don't think anybody can see how they would get going right now. And just a broader point, Karen, I mean, when you say Palestine is back at the center of the agenda for now. But I think, if you look at the real power players in the Arab world, the people with the money, it's the Saudis, the Gulfies, and this is a new generation who don't have that emotional attachment, it appears, to the Palestinian issue. Certainly Mohammed bin Salman, who is the most powerful figure in the Arab world, he's a brutal guy himself, we all know, from the Khashoggi murder and so on, but he has a strategic vision, and that vision is the modernization of Saudi Arabia, and that involves attracting investment from all over the world, the US, China, making Saudi Arabia into a player. And I think he does not want to let the Palestinian issue dominate their approach to the world, and I don't think he will allow that to happen. So yes, of course, everyone's talking about it for now. I actually don't think it will again dominate the Middle Eastern agenda in the way it did, say, from 67 to 2005.
I'll come to MBS in a moment's time. Let me quickly ask you one more question about Hamas. Is the way it's viewed by the Arab governments of the Middle East likely to change as a result of what they've done? Or rather than win respect for itself, has Hamas ended up underlining and perhaps even increasing the apprehensions and concerns people in the Middle East already feel?
Look, I mean, I wouldn't claim to, have an intimate understanding of how the Saudis or the Qataris think, but what I would say is that, look, I think it's probably the view of Hamas is less affected by the atrocities and more affected by their alliance with Iran. If you're in Saudi Arabia, that's what they're scared of. They're scared of Iran, their neighbor, destabilizing Saudi Arabia. That's why the Saudis went to war in Yemen, because they felt the Houthis were acting as kind of proxies for the Iranians. They were, the kind of traumatic Saudi trauma was when missiles landed inside Saudi Arabia and hit the Aramco facilities and so on. And the Saudis went as far as blockading Qatar, their neighbor, partly because they felt that the Qataris were too close to the likes of Hamas and Iran. So I don't think the Saudis necessarily will say, oh, well, these guys are horrible terrorists, we're not having anything to do with them. They may even think, well, what do you expect after the Israelis have treated the Palestinians this way? That is a very common Arab reaction. But that doesn't mean that they're going to say, well, Hamas are fine, because their pre-existing concerns about Hamas are about their relationship with Iran and Iran's threat to Saudi Arabia. And that, if anything, that might accelerate, because what Hamas have shown is that they're a much more capable outfit than people realized. One's reluctant to say anything that's, sounds like you're praising Hamas, which I'm not, but obviously it was an incredible exercise to be able to break into Israel with a number of forces, to have done it in secrecy, evading, all the monitoring the Israelis were believed to have done, was a military operation of a sort we didn't think they were capable of.
Now, let's come to the Saudi Crown Prince. Yesterday, he said that Saudi Arabia stands by the Palestine people to achieve their legitimate rights to a decent life. And up till now, most people have assumed that the deal that the Americans were seeking to broker between Saudi Arabia and Israel was effectively dead in the water. But given what you said about the modernization of Saudi Arabia, and that Palestine is not literally the central core concern for Saudi Arabia, is this really dead in the water, or is it simply paused till we hit a better time?
I think it's probably paused, actually. I think, but it's so unpredictable. It's like, somebody's turned the table over and we'll see where everything falls. But as I say, I think MBS, for all his flaws, has a strategic vision. And I don't think he's going to be shaken from that strategic vision by what's just happened here. And in fact, very interesting, the phrase you quote, have a decent life. He doesn't say a state. The Saudi peace plan, which was proposed, more than a decade ago, involved normalization in return for the establishment of a Palestinian state. What MBS is talking about now is, easing up their conditions. And so that is a real change in the Saudi position. And I think that the only thing that will constrain him is whether he thinks he can do that without hugely weakening his position in the Arab world and among his own people. He is, by some accounts, and we'll never know because they don't have elections in Saudi Arabia, but they say he's popular. But it's also said that very few Saudis like the idea of normalization with Israel. And it was interesting being, I was in Qatar for the World Cup. And at that point, a lot of you were not meant to bring in flags into the stadium, political demonstrations, but there were huge numbers of Palestinian flags in the crowd. And speaking to some of the Qatari officials, they said, well, one of them said to me, look, I know we're meant to confiscate them, but frankly, I'm pleased to see them there because it reminds people that whatever's happening diplomatically, the Arab people still stand with the Palestinians. And I think that the MBS has to think about that. Can he, at what stage could he make peace with Israel? And frankly, given what Israel may be about to do and the images that will be all over Al Jazeera, etc., it's going to be very difficult for him for a while. But long run, these things that we think are world changing and things will never be the same, particularly in the Middle East, they can actually kind of revert to normalcy after a while.
Now, the other major country that has an impact in the Middle East, even though it's located thousands and thousands of miles away, is America. And the Biden administration has expressed its rock-solid, unwavering support for Israel. Biden, in addition, has rushed the U.S. aircraft carrier Gerald Ford and other ships into the area, presumably as a message to Iran and Hezbollah to exercise restraint. But is there a limit to how far Washington can go without adversely affecting its relationship with Saudi Arabia and countries like UAE? Because these, as you said a moment ago, are Muslim-majority nations where public sentiment is not with Israel, and clearly that public sentiment may not like this display of American might.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that what the Americans have done is more or less exactly what you would expect them to do. They would express support for Israel. They would move military assets into the thing, but into the region. But I doubt you'll see them deployed unless this conflict takes a direction that seems unlikely at the moment. So I think for the moment, as with everybody, domestic politics takes precedence. And for the Americans, there's an election coming up. The Republicans will try to hit Biden saying, you've shown weakness. Biden, incidentally, recently transferred quite a lot of money to Iran to free some hostages. The Republicans
has that money actually been in Iranian hands? I thought the Americans had said, or an American bank on their behalf, that the $6 billion has not yet reached Iran.
I think that's certainly the line, sure, but that will be fudged in an election, and they will say, oh, it was American money funded this attack, even if it's not true. But I think it's very bad news for Biden in domestic political terms. One of the reasons he wanted this U.S.-Saudi deal, U.S.-Saudi-Israel deal, was to have, the handshake on the lawn with the Israelis and the Saudis and maybe in America to have a big diplomatic achievement that he could run on in the presidential election that would somehow erase some of the memories of Iran, of Afghanistan and the disaster there. And actually, if you look at Biden's opinion poll ratings, they sort of turned down after the Afghan war and they've, debacle of withdrawal, and they've never fully recovered. However, that's not going to happen now. That deal's kind of at least on hold, as we were saying, for quite some time. And also, it looks like he's now the president who has seen chaos break out in the Middle East. That's not helpful to him, and he will certainly be attacked for weakness, etc., etc. And finally, the oil price is going up again, and one of the things that I think Biden wanted from the Saudis was to get the oil price down, because if you look at the things that motivate Americans when they vote, it's actually the price of petrol is incredibly important, and it's going to be higher in an inflationary period going into an election. So that's bad for Biden.
We're coming to the end of this interview, but I feel I must ask you about two other countries before I end. Other than Israel, Gaza's closest neighbor is Egypt, but Egypt was also the first Arab country to recognize Israel almost 45 years ago. But that's not a policy that is popular with the Egyptian people, and the killing of two Israeli tourists in Alexandria a couple of days ago sort of underlines that. How do you see Egypt handling this crisis? I noticed that Egypt has actually shut the entrance between Gaza and Egypt.
No, and I think that, that's one of the things that I think is often missed when people talk about the Israeli blockade of Gaza, is that Gaza has two borders. It also has a border with Egypt, and Egypt is also blockading Gaza. They have been sealing their border. Now, why are they doing that? Well, I mean, you've got to look at the complexion of the Egyptian government. This is an Egyptian government, a military government, that staged a military coup to get Islamists out of power. So, going back all the way back to the Arab Spring and the fall of Mubarak, you then had a Muslim Brotherhood government that was close to Qatar close to Hamas. Sisi overthrew them, a lot of blood, a lot of people killed, and it's a very, very repressive regime in Egypt. But it is a regime that gets on with the Saudis, and in a complicated way also gets on with the Russians. But but that is very, very opposed to the kind of political Islam represented by Hamas, which they see as a kind of threat to them. So the Egyptian government has absolutely, no truck with Hamas. But as you say, the Egyptian street, the famous Arab street, yeah, I'm sure a lot of Egyptian ordinary people will have a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians right now, and the government will have to pay some account to that. But this is not a democracy, it's a military regime, and they will do their absolute utmost to prevent, say, the Muslim Brotherhood capitalizing on the kind of sentiment, because those are the people that they care about and see as a threat.
Finally, what impact will this have on the Ukraine? So far, it's been the single focus of American Western concern. That clearly is no longer the case. So has the Hamas-Israel crisis diminished the importance of Ukraine, or at least reduced the amount of time as well as the amount of resources that Washington can give it?
Yeah, I'd be worried if I was the Ukrainians, because you'd already seen some diminution or debate in America about how much longer they wanted to keep funding this war, particularly on the Republican side. The Democrats are pretty solid. And when you sorry, when you read that, I beg your pardon, when you read that the Americans are diverting ammunition to Israel, well, the Ukrainians are very short of ammunition as well. They may be slightly different forms of weaponry, but the Israelis are running through their supplies of precision-guided missiles, and those are the kinds of things the Ukrainians want, actually. The American and the West generally have supplied a lot of weaponry to Ukraine, to the point where our own stocks are running down. And if some of those are now going to be diverted towards Israel, as well as all the political attention, as well as all the money, that is a problem. And also there's a sort of limited stock of moral outrage. And to the extent that Ukraine is no longer the number one issue, that's a problem. I think the Russians are playing a waiting game. They sort of think, over time the West loses interest in these issues. They lost interest in Iraq, they lost interest in Afghanistan. Over the long run, they will lose interest in Ukraine. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but what I think you might see is a diversion of American interest towards the Middle East again, a bit towards China, still some support for Ukraine. But I think that the thing that doesn't really work for the Russian view of the West will lose interest is that Europe cannot lose interest in Ukraine because it's their frontier. And so I think you'll probably see more European, basically a kind of shift in the complexion of Western support, more European support, slightly less American support. The question for the Ukrainians is, can the Europeans provide the kind of, say, munitions that the Americans provide, the sophisticated munitions the Americans can provide? It's not clear. And whether the Europeans have the money, not clear. But I don't think, I think it's bad for Ukraine, but it's not catastrophic what's just happened.
Could you permit me one last question about Moscow and Beijing? Because they are two very important countries. Beijing has called for de-escalation and a renewed focus on the two-nation solution. Moscow, as far as I can tell, hasn't said very much at all. Neither, by the way, as far as I know, has taken an explicit stand on any one side. So how do you read the response from these two countries?
Well, of course, they'll be thinking of it in terms of their own national interest. I think that they don't quite know how to respond. I mean, and who of us do? To some extent, the Russians will think. How will they think about it? They will think anything that damages America is good. So they'll be looking at it through that prism. On the other hand, they don't necessarily want to position themselves as wholeheartedly behind Hamas, because then that alienates Israel, with which actually they have an important relationship. It's a complicated relationship, but Netanyahu. I remember meeting him some years ago, and he was just back from Moscow, and he was very proud of his relationship with Putin. There's a lot of influential Russians who have live in Israel, have moved there. Some of them are dissidents, some are not actually. They retain a kind of foot in Moscow, foot in Tel Aviv. And the Israelis and the Russians, although they're on different sides in Syria, have maintained a kind of understanding about what basically not shooting at each other in the Syrian war. And if you talk to the Israelis, for example, about, well, why aren't you more full-throated in their support for Ukraine, they would say, well, we can't afford to alienate Russia because they're kind of our neighbor in Syria. So it's a huge tangled web. I mean, this being the Middle East, what would you expect? Of interest. For the Chinese, I think it must be a bit baffling. In some ways, it's very their default reaction is very easy. They always say, we're the force for peace. We're the people who are going to, the Americans stir up wars, we bring peace. That's their line. But actually, kind of messes up their diplomatic push in the Middle East. One of their great achievements was brokering a Saudi-Iranian deal, which was signed in Beijing. And I think really set alarm bells running in America. The Americans said, oh, we don't care, fine, But in fact, I think it may have been one of the impetuses behind the American effort to get re-involved and to broker the Saudi-Israeli deal, because they don't like the idea of being pushed out of the Middle East by the Chinese. But I think that to the extent that, Saudi and Iran are then back at each other's throats, that wouldn't be good for China. And also, who have the BRICS just let in? Iran. And that was a pretty controversial move even at the time, maybe about to get even more difficult. So I think that the Chinese, the Americans sort of joked when they said that when people said, oh, well, China's going to displace America as the dominant power in the Middle East. Well, best of luck to them. They don't know what they're getting into. And this is a deeply kind of complicated set of relationships. And the Chinese may have felt there were some easy wins there, but I think they're discovering that there's not much that is easy in the Middle East.
Mr. Rachman, thank you very much for truly a tour d'horizon. I think this has been revealing, eye-opening, and very educative for our audience. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.